They were digging around my house like I was some kind of prisoner. That's what I yelled, standing on my porch that morning, boots coated in dust, watching massive backhoes carve into the earth. 8 feet deep, circling my entire property like they were building a moat around a castle. Except this wasn't some medieval fortress. It was my family's ranch. And the one orchestrating it all was my own HOA president, Susan Hernandez. I couldn't move. I couldn't drive out. Concrete barriers were already stacked along the fence line, and armed security patrolled the road like this was a war zone. The sound of diesel engines rattled my chest as dirt piled up higher and higher. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I'd been imprisoned on my own land. What would you do if someone turned your home into a cage? If the very people who claim to represent your community were the ones trying to bury you alive? My name's Charles Martin. I'm 42, a mechanic downtown. I fix trucks, change oil, rebuild transmissions, just a working man. But this land, 12 acres of rolling hills with a ranch house built in the 50s, this has been my family's heart for 3 generations. My granddad bought it when it was nothing but dirt and dreams. My father expanded it, built the workshop where I spend most of my days, tools hanging on pegboards that still smell like motor oil and sawdust. And me. I've always believed it was my turn to protect it. Some mornings I'd stand in that shop, holding my granddad's old wrench, wondering if I was strong enough to guard what they'd built. Because this place wasn't just soil and lumber. It was memory. It was stubborn pride. It was the proof of every sacrifice they'd made before me. And maybe that's why Susan came after it. It started small, with a letter. Fancy letterhead, expensive paper, the kind meant to intimidate you before you've even opened the envelope. Her offer was $450,000, immediate closing preferred. Now I might not be a real estate expert, but my gut knew something was off. I'd seen smaller lots go for almost double that. So I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and started digging online. What I found made my blood run cold. Properties like mine? They were selling for 800 grand, even pushing $1 million. And here she was, tossing me barely half of that, as if I was some fool who'd roll over at the first sign of money. That's when I realized this wasn't just a bad offer. It was a setup. Susan wasn't some random buyer. She was a lawyer, an HOA president, a woman with a reputation for sniffing out distressed properties and flipping them for profit. I'd heard the whispers in town, families suddenly forced to sell after surprise safety violations or community concerns. But I never imagined she'd try it with me, with land that had been in my family since the Eisenhower era. I set the letter down and looked around my kitchen. The old wooden beams above me, the faded wallpaper my mom picked out back in the 70s, the smell of oil and hay that always seemed to follow me in from the shop. And I swore, right there, no amount of money was going to buy me out. That night, as the crickets hummed and the wind rattled the gate, my security camera picked up movement. A figure in dark clothing at my mailbox. 11 p.m., too late for deliveries. The way he moved, slow and deliberate, set my teeth on edge. By morning, I was at that box before the coffee pot had even finished brewing. Inside was no letter, just a small metallic object wrapped in plastic. My hands shook as I unwrapped it. A surveyor's pin. Bent, damaged, with a note taped to it in block letters, "Check your boundaries carefully." I'd lived on this property my whole life. I knew every tree line, every fence post, every acre like the back of my hand. But holding that bent pin made my stomach twist in a way I can't explain. And then, like clockwork, my neighbor Sam showed up. Retired county inspector, steady as they come, always with a mug of coffee in hand. He studied the pin with that serious look of his, then muttered the words that confirmed my worst fear. "This changes everything." I didn't know what he meant yet, but when Sam's face went pale, I knew trouble was brewing. And then my phone buzzed. No words, just a photo. A picture of my house taken from somewhere on my land, time-stamped just 3 hours earlier. Someone had been here, on my property, watching me. My grandfather used to say, "The land remembers who cares for it." But standing there, clutching that bent pin, staring at that photo, I wondered if the land could remember something else too: fear. And for the first time, I started to think this wasn't just about money. It was about power. and the people coming after me weren't planning to stop until they had everything. Have you ever had that moment when the air feels heavy, like something big is about to drop? That's what Monday morning felt like. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, my boots were still damp from the dew, and I couldn't shake the image of that photo. My house, captured in the dead of night, time-stamped like some kind of warning. I told myself not to panic, but deep down I knew this wasn't random. Someone was watching, someone who wanted me to know I wasn't alone on my own land. By mid-morning, the sound of diesel engines carried across the hills. Not the usual farm trucks or utility vans. No, this was official. 3 county vehicles rolled into my driveway like they owned the place. Doors slammed, and out stepped Susan Hernandez herself, polished suit, sharp heels clicking on gravel, clipboard hugged to her chest like it was a weapon. Behind her came a small army of inspectors. Building inspector, environmental assessor, safety coordinator. All legit county employees with laminated badges swinging in the breeze. They spread out across my property like ants at a picnic. Susan walked up to me with that politician's smile. "Charles," she said, her voice sugar-sweet, "we just want to make sure your property is safe for the community." Safe, that word rolled off her tongue like poison. I watched as her team poked at my septic system, tapped my electrical box, measured the edge of my workshop like they were already planning the demolition. Within an hour, they'd discovered violations I'd never even heard of. Contaminated groundwater, fire hazards, encroachment on easements that had been in place since my father built the shop 50 years ago. Funny how none of this was an issue until the day after I refused Susan's offer. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. "They're trespassing," I told the dispatcher. "They're making up violations out of thin air." 20 minutes later, Deputy Morgan showed up. Solid guy, late 30s, the kind of officer who takes his job seriously. He listened, took notes, looked over the permits Susan handed him, then he shook his head. "Sir, these documents are valid. Emergency permits signed last night. Without a court order, I can't interfere." Emergency permits, signed after I refused her offer, stamped and sealed like it was all real. My gut told me it was fake, but Morgan's body cam was rolling and he had to follow procedure. Susan smiled at me then, and for just a flicker of a moment her mask slipped. "Most people," she said almost to herself, "break down by now. You're more resilient than the demographic suggests." Demographic, she wasn't just after my land. She was studying me, testing how far I'd bend before I broke. By noon, her inspection team had left a stack of violation notices thicker than a phone book on my kitchen counter. Repairs that would cost tens of thousands of dollars, repairs that couldn't even start unless I moved out. And there she was, standing in my driveway, ready with her solution. "Charles, if the financial strain is too much, I can make another offer. Cash, quick closing." I wanted to throw her off my land. Instead, I stood there in silence, fists clenched, listening to the crunch of gravel as her SUV pulled away. Sam showed up that evening, his brow furrowed deeper than usual. He laid the papers out on my kitchen table, examining seals, dates, and signatures with his magnifying glass. "Charles," he muttered, "this isn't right. These permits read like they were stitched together in a hurry, backdated, wrong seal placement. And this engineer," he tapped the signature line. "He retired last year. No way he signed this." The room felt colder as his words sank in. And then came another text. No words this time, just another photo. Fresh survey stakes driven into the soil along my fence line. The picture was grainy, taken just before dawn, but the angle told me someone had been 20 feet from my workshop, 20 feet from where I'd been working the day before. How many times had they walked my land without me knowing? Sam leaned back in his chair and sighed. "They're rewriting your boundaries, Charles. They'll move the lines until your shop looks like it's built on their easement. Once that happens, you're finished." The next morning, heavy machinery arrived before sunrise. Not construction crews for repair, not county workers fixing anything. No, these were backhoes and survey tripods. They moved like a unit, precise, military almost. I watched from my workshop window as orange spray paint marked lines across the soil. Lines that didn't match my deed. The foreman barked orders into his radio. Susan stood at the edge of the property, sunglasses on, arms folded, watching it all unfold. By 6 a.m., the first trench was already being dug. I called 911 again. "They're digging around my house," I shouted into the phone. "They're trapping me on my own land." The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost bored. "Sir, if the permits are valid, they're authorized." Authorized? That word hit harder than the sound of steel teeth biting into earth. I tried to build a makeshift bridge across one of the trenches, just some 2x4s from the shop, nailed together like a farmer's footbridge. For 30 seconds I thought I'd beaten them, and then it collapsed under my weight, sending me crashing into 8 feet of muddy water while Susan's crew laughed from the sidelines. Soaked, freezing, covered in muck, I climbed out, and for the first time I wondered if maybe Susan was right. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I was fighting a war I couldn't win. But then one of the younger workers approached me quietly during their lunch break. He glanced over his shoulder, voice low. "They're paying us double to finish by Sunday night. Boss says it's a community emergency, but this doesn't look like flood prevention. Looks more like they're trying to keep you in." That one comment lit a fire in me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. They were building a prison around my family's land. And as I stood there, mud dripping from my jeans, staring at those machines chewing into the soil, I swore on my grandfather's tools. This wasn't over. What do you do when the cavalry never comes? That's the thought that gnawed at me Tuesday afternoon as I stood in my workshop, staring at trenches that now carved my land into pieces. 8 feet deep, swallowing everything in their path. Susan's crew moved with military precision like they'd practiced this before. And maybe they had. Maybe I wasn't the first. I'd called the sheriff. I'd called the county. I'd begged for help. But every voice on the other end of the line pointed me back to one thing: the permits. Always the permits. And Susan had them, stamped and signed, even if they were fakes. By Wednesday morning, I realized this fight wasn't just about trenches. It was about survival. The first blow came when the internet went down. Not just a bad connection, cut. Severed clean during what Susan's foreman called routine excavation. The tech who showed up shook his head, said the trench was now classified as a confined space, and his company wasn't allowed to touch it without clearance. Clearance, of course, controlled by Susan's people. Then the power went. Lines sliced accidentally by a backhoe. By noon, my house was dark. No lights, no refrigerator, no way to charge my phone except in my truck. I sat at the kitchen table that night with candles burning, shadows flickering across the walls like ghosts of my family watching me struggle. But the worst came on Sunday when I turned the tap and nothing but a sputter of air came out. The water line had been tampered with at the curb. Not shut off officially, no paperwork. Just choked at the valve, tight enough to make the house unlivable. That's when it hit me. Susan wasn't just trying to scare me. She was trying to wear me down, turn my own land into a prison cell until I broke. And then came the whispers. At the community center, she started holding what she called safety meetings. Standing in front of my neighbors with that same sweet lawyer's smile, spreading rumors that I was running a drug operation. Marijuana grows, strange odors, late-night activity. Lies stacked on lies, and people bought them. The newer neighbors, those who'd moved in over the last 5 years, were quick to believe her. They didn't know me, didn't know my father or the workshop he built with his bare hands. All they saw was a slick president with official-looking papers. But the older neighbors, the ones who'd known my family for decades, they weren't so quick to turn. Sam especially. He became my voice when I couldn't be there, telling anyone who'd listened that the Martins had been good neighbors for 3 generations. Still, the community was splitting in two. Online message boards lit up with debates about property values and dangerous neighbors. My name was dragged through the mud while I was still hauling 5-gallon buckets of water from Sam's house just to flush a toilet. One evening, struggling across the barrier with grocery bags cutting into my hands, Susan rolled down her SUV window. "Careful there, Charles," she called with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to get hurt on your own property." Her words dripped sarcasm, and her smirk told me everything. She was enjoying this, watching me stumble through mud and concrete like some kind of caged animal. That night, I decided if she wanted a war of documentation, I'd give her one. For 2 days straight, I installed a security system that would make a casino jealous. Cameras hidden in fence posts, motion sensors along the tree line, audio recorders tucked into survey stakes. Sam helped me set it all up, double-checking every angle. If they're rewriting boundaries, I told him, I want every inch of it on tape. By Thursday night, the system was live, and by Friday, it was already catching things I never would have seen otherwise. Crews sneaking in before dawn, spray-painting new boundary lines, moving stakes by feet at a time. They thought nobody was watching, but I was. Still, the pressure was building. Anonymous notes kept showing up in my mailbox. A Polaroid of fresh paint marks with a time scrawled in black marker. A scrap of paper with a street name and lot number. No signatures, no instructions, just breadcrumbs like someone on the inside was trying to guide me without blowing their cover. It was hard to tell if these were warnings or threats, but they kept me on edge, packing the floor at night, listening to the hum of my new cameras. Then came Saturday morning. The sound of backhoes firing up at 6 a.m. shook the windows. The crew worked like soldiers, digging trenches deeper and wider, while Susan watched from her white SUV, arms crossed like a general at war. I stood at the window, fists clenched. My land, the place where my grandfather planted his first fence post, was now surrounded by ditches and concrete like a fortress. And yet what cut the deepest wasn't the machines. It was the laughter. Her crew laughed when my bridge collapsed. Laughed when I climbed out of that trench soaked in mud. Laughed like I was nothing but entertainment for them. That night I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the hum of distant generators and the faint metallic clank of machinery still working under floodlights. I felt trapped, cornered, humiliated. But I also felt something else. A spark. Because the cameras were rolling. The notes were coming. And someone out there, someone I didn't know, was telling me to keep recording, keep documenting, because the truth has a way of coming out when you least expect it. And in that silence, with the candle flame flickering low, I swore one thing. Susan thought she was building my prison, but she had no idea she was also building the walls of her own. Betrayal has a sound. For me, it was the click of a mouse. Wednesday morning, I woke up to find my name plastered across a blog post on Truth Seeker Valley, the very guy who had emailed me saying he was on my side, that he'd been tracking HOA corruption for months. I thought he was going to expose Susan. Instead, the headline read, HOA takes necessary action against property encroachment. Every detail I had shared with him, every violation notice, every photo, every late-night text had been twisted. He painted me as a stubborn property owner, reckless, dangerous, endangering my neighbors with my refusal to comply. I read it 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood, but no, he sold me out. My hands shook as I slammed the laptop shut. The one person I thought would help shine a light on Susan's lies had turned my life into her victory speech. Sam found me packing the porch, fists clenched, boots grinding against gravel. He didn't even need to ask what was wrong. He could see it in my face. They got to him, I muttered. They bought him. Sam just nodded. He'd seen it before, people folding when the check was big enough. But that wasn't the only betrayal waiting for me. By Thursday evening, I thought maybe I was finally making headway. I'd hired a lawyer, Michael Reeves. Everyone said he was solid, 45 years old, knew property law inside and out. For the first time, I felt like I had someone in my corner who understood the system. He laid out strategies, talked about appeals, loopholes, ways to push back. For 2 hours in his office, I actually felt hope. But hope doesn't last long when you're standing in a house with no power, hauling water in buckets just to wash your hands. Friday morning, I stopped by his office again, picked up 2 coffees on the way, figured I'd bring him one while we went over paperwork. I was halfway to his desk when I froze. His voice drifted through the cracked door, calm, smooth, confident. "Yes, Susan," he said. "The isolation strategy is working perfectly. He trusts everything I tell him about legal options. How much longer do you need to finalize the paperwork?" The cups trembled in my hands. Hot coffee splashed onto my wrist, but I didn't even flinch. My own lawyer, feeding her everything. I stood there, frozen, listening as the man I'd trusted sold me out to the very woman who was digging trenches around my life. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. Every meeting, every conversation, every scrap of strategy, all of it funneled straight into her hands. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and hit record. If this was the game they were playing, I needed proof. He kept talking, mentioning timelines, fees, even my emotional state, like I was nothing more than a pawn in their little experiment. By the time I walked out of that office, I wasn't even angry. I was hollow. It hit me then, this wasn't chaos. It was precision. The permits, the inspections, the media smear, the legal betrayal, it was all part of a machine. A machine designed to grind people down until they sold cheap or lost everything. And I wasn't just fighting Susan. I was fighting every cog in that machine. That night I sat in the workshop surrounded by my grandfather's tools, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to the air. I thought about him, about my father, about all the nights they must have stood here worrying about weather, crops, money. But at least their fight was honest. Mine was rigged from the start. I felt the weight pressing down. No internet, no power, no water. A community split in two. A blogger turned traitor, a lawyer working for the enemy, and trenches sealing me in like a coffin. For the first time, I felt completely alone. And then, the anonymous notes started to make sense. The bent surveyor's pin, the Polaroid of fresh paint marks, the scribbled street names, they weren't threats. They were breadcrumbs. Someone out there wanted me to see the truth. That Friday night, as I checked the new security footage, my cameras caught workers sneaking back onto the property. Spray painting new lines, moving stakes, redrawing my world 1 inch at a time. They didn't know I was watching. And as the feed rolled, I realized something important. Maybe I was trapped, maybe the system was rigged, but I had something they didn't. Proof. Susan thought she'd isolated me, but she didn't know I'd turned her prison into my evidence locker. And somewhere deep down, under the anger and the fear, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. Determination. Because sometimes rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it's the place you push off from. And Susan, she had no idea what was coming. You ever hit that point where you realize nobody's coming to save you, so you decide to save yourself? That was me Saturday morning. My house was dark, my tap dry, my driveway sealed behind walls of concrete and mud. My lawyer was a traitor, the blogger a fraud, my neighbors divided. But the cameras I'd installed, the ones Susan didn't know about, were rolling. And that meant I had something stronger than her fake permits. Proof. I spent the better part of that weekend hunched over a laptop, splicing footage, organizing files. Clips of her crew moving survey stakes. Audio of her giving instructions in the dead of night. Snapshots of forged signatures, permits backdated with sloppy timestamps. Piece by piece, the picture was coming together. It wasn't just harassment, it was a blueprint for theft. Sam watched me from the other side of the workbench, his arms crossed. "You're building a case," he said quietly. "Just make sure you survive long enough to use it." He was right, because every day, Susan found a new way to tighten the noose. That afternoon, the faucets went from a weak trickle to nothing. I found fresh scrape marks on the street-side valve box, the cap missing, a plastic seal snapped across the slot. Not an official shutoff. Just another scare tactic, something designed to make the place unlivable while leaving me on the hook if I broke the seal myself. By evening, I was hauling 5-gallon buckets from Sam's property, sweat dripping, arms burning. Susan sat in her SUV across the street, watching, smirking, rolling her window down just enough to call out, "Careful there, Charles, wouldn't want you to collapse." Her voice was like nails on a chalkboard. That night I uploaded my first video, nothing fancy, just handheld footage of the trenches, the barriers, the utility boxes tagged and locked. My voice in the background, steady and tired. The HOA trapped me on my own land. I didn't know what to expect. By morning, the clip had spread further than I'd imagined. Some people raged in the comments. This is criminal. How is this even legal? Others mocked me, called me paranoid, claimed I staged the whole thing. That stung more than I cared to admit. But then reporters started calling. Local news stations wanted interviews. One even drove out, though Susan's hired guards blocked them at the gate, telling them it was a private HOA matter. The reporter went live from the roadside anyway. We are being denied access to cover what residents describe as an unprecedented HOA action, she told the camera, her voice sharp with indignation. If this was truly about safety, why block media access? The video of her being turned away spread even faster than mine. And suddenly, Susan wasn't in control of the story anymore. She tried to claw it back. That night she appeared on the evening news, all crocodile tears and fake sympathy. We're just worried about Mr. Martin's well-being, she cooed. His behavior suggests serious mental health concerns. We're only trying to protect him before something tragic happens. Her words dripped with false concern, but the backdrop betrayed her. Because while she talked about helping me, the camera caught the truth. Massive trenches and concrete barriers rising behind her like prison walls. The contradiction was too much for people to ignore. Even those who doubted me began asking hard questions. Why was the HOA building fortifications around a man's home? Why cut utilities? Why block the press? Susan was losing her grip. And that's when the notes started coming again. This one was longer, slipped into my mailbox late Sunday night, the handwriting sharp, urgent. Whatever happens Monday morning, don't panic. The truth has a way of coming out when you least expect it. Keep recording everything. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: hope. Because whoever was leaving those messages knew what was coming. Monday morning arrived with a sound I'll never forget, the hollow slam of concrete barriers locking into place at the final access point. The echo rattled my bones. My driveway was gone. My land sealed tight like a tomb. I grabbed my phone, filming the wall as it rose. My voice shook but stayed steady. They've trapped me. I can't leave my own home. By noon, the video had thousands of views. Neighbors showed up at the roadside, some shouting in support, others shaking their heads, muttering about dangerous property owners. The split was widening, but this time I wasn't alone. Sam stood with me, silent but firm. And I knew, watching those concrete barriers settle into place, that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family Susan had crushed before. And this time, the cameras were rolling. If you've ever been truly cornered, you know there's a point where fear burns itself out and all that's left is clarity. That's where I was by Tuesday morning. The trenches were finished, the barriers locked, my house sealed tighter than Fort Knox. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. The news story had lit a fire I hadn't expected. Reporters kept calling. Neighbors were snapping photos from the roadside, sharing them online. And then the call came from an unexpected voice, Deputy Morgan, the same officer who'd shrugged at Susan's permits a week before. "Charles," he said, his voice lower, cautious. "Off the record, some of these documents she's waving around, they don't check out. Too many signatures from people who don't even work in the department anymore." I sat on the porch, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding. "So what happens now?" "Nothing yet," he muttered. "She's got political cover. Judges, county officials, even state regulators with their fingerprints on this. But if you keep recording, if you keep the evidence flowing, sooner or later someone higher up will notice." For the first time, I felt the system creak. Not break, not bend, but shift. And Susan must have felt it too, because that very night she escalated. At midnight, floodlights lit up outside my window. Her crew moved in again, this time not with backhoes, but with clipboards and cameras of their own. They circled my house like vultures, photographing every window, every gutter, every crack in the siding. At one point, Susan herself walked up to the porch steps. She looked straight at my hidden camera, gave the faintest smile, and whispered, "Tick-tock." Then she turned and walked back into the dark. By morning, fresh notices were taped to my door. Unsafe dwelling, structural concerns, mandatory evacuation. She was building a legal narrative brick by brick, turning my home from property into liability. But here's the thing. When you push people too far, they stop playing defense. That afternoon, I uploaded a new compilation. Susan's crew sneaking in before dawn. Survey stakes moved overnight. Permit signatures that didn't match public records. And then the kicker, audio of my own lawyer, Michael Reeves, conspiring with her behind closed doors. The video blew up, not just locally this time. Regional outlets picked it up. Lawyers started weighing in online, questioning the legality of HOA powers. One even said, if true, this could amount to organized racketeering. Racketeering, the word rolled in my head like a thunderclap. And that's when the anonymous notes finally clicked. I laid them out across my workshop table, smoothing the scraps of paper with my hands. The bent surveyor's pin, the Polaroid of paint marks, the scribbled street names. When I lined them up, a pattern emerged. It wasn't random. It was a trail leading to other properties, other families, other victims. Sam leaned over my shoulder, squinting. Charles, she's done this before. My stomach turned as the realization sank in. Susan wasn't targeting me by accident. I was just next in line. And if the notes were right, she'd perfected this routine, fake permits, sudden inspections, utility sabotage, over and over again, each time forcing desperate families to sell cheap before flipping their land for profit. It wasn't personal, it was business. Cold, calculated business. I uploaded another video that night. Not about me this time. About the pattern, about the other families. I blurred addresses, hid names, but laid out the connections. One by one, people started reaching out, emails, phone calls, direct messages. Families from 3 towns over, some moved years ago, some still fighting, all with the same story. An HOA president named Susan Hernandez who'd crushed them under safety violations until they broke. And suddenly, my story wasn't just a local feud. It was part of a bigger picture. The pressure must have rattled Susan, because on Thursday, she played her boldest card yet. I woke up to find 2 uniformed men at my gate, badges on their belts, holstered pistols, clipboards in hand. They weren't county inspectors. They weren't deputies. They introduced themselves as private compliance officers, hired by the HOA. Their orders, to escort me off the property for my own safety. I laughed, bitter and sharp. You're trespassing, I told them, camera rolling. This is my land. They smirked but didn't cross the trench. One read from a paper legal jargon about community protection and emergency enforcement. But then Sam stepped up beside me, arms folded across his chest. Funny, he said loud enough for my camera to catch, because that order isn't stamped by any court I've ever seen. The men froze. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in their eyes. They left after a few more empty threats, kicking dust as they went. That night, another note appeared, slipped into my mailbox, same sharp handwriting. You're getting close, don't stop now, she's desperate. That's when people make mistakes. I held the note under the porch light, the paper trembling in my hand. Whoever this ally was, they weren't wrong. Because Susan was slipping. Her perfect machine, polished permits, staged inspections, slick lies was showing cracks. The media was circling, the law sniffing at her trail, and the families she'd burned were speaking up. But desperation is dangerous. And as I tucked that note into the stack on my workshop bench, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was about to get uglier than ever. Desperation has a smell. It's sharp, metallic like ozone before a storm. And by Friday night, that's exactly what hung in the air around my ranch. Susan was running out of time. The media had caught hold of my story, law enforcement was whispering about irregular permits, and families she'd burned were starting to step forward. But cornered animals don't retreat. They attack. It started with noise. Saturday morning, 6 a.m. sharp, industrial generators roared to life outside my window. The kind of bone-shaking hum that makes your chest vibrate. Floodlights snapped on, turning night into day. Her crew moved with new urgency, spray-painting fresh lines, erecting new fencing panels, hammering steel posts into the earth with reckless speed. I grabbed my phone, filming from the porch. They're fortifying now, I whispered to the camera. Not just trenches, they're building walls. And then, as if on cue, the power in my truck died. I popped the hood and stared at the battery. Cables sliced clean, not frayed, not worn, cut. That same afternoon, I found my workshop locks mangled, the door swinging open in the wind. Inside, tools were scattered across the floor. Nothing stolen, just broken, sabotaged. My grandfather's wrench bent in half like a cruel joke. I stood there in the doorway, fists trembling, rage boiling in my chest. Susan wasn't just after the land anymore. She was after me. Sam showed up later with his old shotgun slung across his shoulder. He didn't say much, just handed me a fresh lock for the workshop door. His silence said more than words ever could, "Be ready." But Susan wasn't finished. That night I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate. I rolled out of bed, heart hammering, and checked the monitors. 4 masked men, black clothing, flashlights cutting across my yard. They weren't inspectors, they weren't workers, they were something else entirely. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher answered, but before I could speak, one of the men looked straight into my camera lens, lifted a gloved finger to his lips, and cut the feed. The screen went black. Panic surged in my chest like ice water. I bolted to the porch, shotgun in hand, floodlight switch flipped on. The yard lit up in a blaze of white, and just like that, they were gone. No vehicles, no footsteps retreating, just empty silence and the creak of the gate in the night wind. The sheriff's deputies didn't show for 40 minutes. By then there was no trace. No footprints, no cut wires, no proof. Just me standing in the mud, wild-eyed and trembling, holding a shotgun like a madman. Susan spun it the next morning on local radio. "He's unstable," she said smoothly. "Armed, dangerous, paranoid, we're worried about the community's safety." The humiliation was almost worse than the fear. But here's the thing about cameras. You can cut one feed, maybe 2. But if you do know where they all are, you leave yourself exposed. And Susan didn't know I'd hidden backups. By Sunday night, I was reviewing footage from a camera she hadn't found, buried inside a fence post on the west side of the property. And there it was, clear as day. Susan herself, standing under cover of darkness, flanked by 2 men in black. She pointed at my house, whispered something I couldn't hear, then gestured toward my workshop. The men nodded, one pulling bolt cutters from his bag. My hands went cold as I watched them snip the wires to my truck, smash the lock on my workshop, scatter tools like they were tossing cards into the wind. Susan supervised the whole thing, calm, smiling. This wasn't sabotage, this was orchestration. I sat there frozen, replaying the clip over and over, my chest tight, my breath shallow. This was the smoking gun, the proof that turned suspicion into conspiracy, harassment into criminal intent. Sam leaned over my shoulder, jaw tight. "Charles," he said slowly, "this isn't just HOA bullying anymore. This is evidence of a felony." And he was right. The machine Susan had built was unraveling. Her desperation had pushed her to make a mistake, the one thing predators always do when they think they're untouchable. She'd left fingerprints on her own crime. I uploaded the footage that night, shaky hands hovering over the keyboard before hitting publish. I didn't even add commentary this time. The video spoke for itself. By morning, the clip had exploded. National outlets were picking it up. Reporters camped outside the trench walls. Hashtags trended across platforms. People weren't asking if Susan was corrupt anymore. They were asking how many families she'd done this to and why no one stopped her sooner. And Susan. For the first time since this started, she wasn't smiling. That afternoon, she showed up at the edge of my property, cameras rolling, reporters swarming. Her voice shook as she barked denials, calling the footage deepfake manipulation and me a threat to community peace. But even her own crew looked uneasy now. One man wouldn't meet her eyes. Another shuffled his boots, jaw tight, like maybe he knew the gig was up. Because truth has a way of catching fire once it's out in the open. And no wall, no trench, no army of fake inspectors could stop it now. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. Because when people like Susan start to fall, they don't go quietly. And standing on that porch, watching her shout into a dozen microphones. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The storm wasn't over. It was just about to break. Justice doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in slowly, like dawn after the longest night. The morning after I posted the footage, I woke to the sound of helicopters thudding overhead. News choppers. Their cameras hovered above the trenches, zooming in on my house, the barriers, the concrete walls that had sealed me in for weeks. For the first time, the world was seeing it from above. My land didn't look like a community safety project anymore. It looked like a prison. By noon, the county sheriff himself rolled up in a black SUV, lights flashing. Deputies fanned out across the road, pushing back reporters while he strode toward my gate. No clipboard, no permits, just a firm voice. "Charles, we're here to see the footage." I led him to the workshop, heart pounding. He watched silently as I replayed the video, the trenching crews moving stakes, Susan whispering to men in black, the sabotage of my truck and workshop. He didn't say a word until the final clip froze on Susan's face under the floodlights. Then he muttered almost to himself, "That's it, that's the line." Within hours, warrants were signed. Not by the judges Susan had in her pocket, but by state investigators who'd been tipped off when the video went national. By sunset, unmarked vehicles swarmed the HOA offices downtown. Boxes of files, hard drives, contracts, all carried out into waiting vans. And Susan. She was led away in handcuffs. It wasn't clean. She shouted, cried, threatened lawsuits, claimed she was framed. But the cameras caught it all, the same cameras she'd once mocked me for installing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When the news broke that night, I sat on my porch, Sam beside me, watching the glow of floodlights across the road. My land was still scarred with trenches, my house still dark without power or water. But for the first time, the air felt lighter. Neighbors who'd once whispered behind my back now stopped at the roadside, offering nods, waves, even apologies. Some admitted they'd been scared to speak up. Others confessed they'd believed Susan until the footage told the truth. Funny thing about truth, it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, waiting for the right moment to break through the noise. The weeks that followed were slow. Crews filled the trenches, patched the utility lines, rebuilt what Susan's team had destroyed. The county offered formal apologies, though they couldn't scrub away the stain of their complicity. Too many signatures had been stamped without question. Too many officials had looked the other way. But my land stood. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang, I walked the fence line with Sam. Dust clung to our boots, the gate creaked on its hinges, and for the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful instead of suffocating. He stopped, leaned against a fence post, and said, "Your grandfather would have been proud." I swallowed hard, staring at the rolling hills. Sometimes I thought I wasn't strong enough to hold it. Sam shook his head. "Strength isn't about never breaking, it's about standing back up when they try to bury you." His words settled deep. Because the truth is, I had broken. The nights I sat in darkness, waterless, powerless, mocked and betrayed, I'd felt hollow, ready to give in. But something deeper had carried me. Not pride, not stubbornness. Memory. The memory of my grandfather's hands planting that first fence post, my father's sweat building the workshop, the years of ordinary mornings filled with ordinary work that made this place home. That's what I'd fought for, not just land, legacy. Susan's trial dragged on for months. Charges of fraud, forgery, racketeering, conspiracy. Turns out I wasn't her first victim, just the first one who refused to break. Families from across the county testified, their stories eerily similar. Together, our voices painted a picture too clear to ignore. And in the end, the gavel fell. She wasn't just fined, she wasn't just disbarred, she was sentenced. I didn't cheer when the verdict came down, I didn't smile. I just sat quietly, letting the weight of it wash over me. Because justice doesn't erase scars. It doesn't refill the trenches or restore the nights of lost sleep. But it brings something else. Closure. One night, months later, I sat on the porch again, listening to the soft hum of crickets. My house was lit, water flowed, the workshop smelled of oil and wood again. And I thought about Susan's last words to me, the whisper caught on tape. Tick-tock. She meant it as a threat, but in the end it was a prophecy. Because time runs out for everyone who builds their empire on lies. And sometimes the only thing stronger than power is patience. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.